Hi, everybody. I hope you are doing well today. I know today I am up against some pretty big stuff happening in the news that probably many of you are watching. If you're here watching this live, man, thank you. I appreciate you giving me some of your time as we dive into the God's Word together. If you're coming later and checking this out sometime throughout the week, to be honest, that's probably what I would do too. But I'm glad that you're here and paying attention to this. If I'm right, this is week 11 of our series following the Golden Thread, which is crazy. We've been doing this for almost 3 months, this series, and we're about halfway through the Old Testament. Last week we talked, if you remember, about King David and the Davidic covenant. This week we'll spend time talking about the temple. It's kind of a break from our traditional pattern. We've been focused on kind of the narrative plot of how God's redemptive plan unfolds, and especially the covenants. But if we're following the golden thread, then we need to set aside some time to talk about the temple and the tabernacle, because those are keys to understanding religion in Israel, even Israel's kind of identity as a nation, both in the Old Testament and in the New. And it's pretty important for us to understand if we're going to understand Jesus and his person and his ministry well also. So last week we talked about David being anointed king, and he comes to the prophet Nathan and says, we're living in permanent dwellings here in the land of Israel. It's not right that God is still living in a tent, the tabernacle. I want to build for the Lord a permanent house. At first, Nathan says, great, go and do what you have in your heart to do. But later, the Lord comes to him and says to Nathan, go back and tell David, no. It's not for you to do this. I know you want to build me a permanent house, but instead, I'm going to build a house for you, a dynasty that will be established forever. As for a temple, that's going to fall to your son Solomon to do. When you move into the book of 1 Kings, chapter 2, David is literally on his deathbed and inaugurates, perfect passage for today, right? Inaugurates Solomon to be king. And he gives him advice. He says, be strong, act like a man. It's such kind of dad advice to a son, right? Act like a man. Walk in the ways of the Lord and in the law of Moses, so that it will go well with you, and so that the Lord will keep his promise to me, if your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. There's that conditional element to the Davidic covenant. You will have someone on the throne if they continue to walk with me. Initially, Solomon looks like he's off to a great start. You know this passage, it's the famous passage where God says, ask of me anything you want, and Solomon asks for wisdom. And the beginning of his reign is definitely characterized by wisdom. You can see through the early days he's making wise choices, wise judgments, and he begins to make preparations to build the temple that God had said he would be allowed to build. And when you get to the book of 2 Kings chapter 6, the temple is being built. Instead of me describing the building of the temple and its furnishings, I asked one of my good friends, Steven Lulich. He's a professor at IU. He's one of the elders here at the church. He's going to join me here. I'm going to flip over to him to a message that he recorded, because he knows the temple and the tabernacle better than anyone I know. And so I asked him to step in and give us a little bit of detail about the construction of the temple, what it looked like, and the symbolism behind the temple. Thank you, Stephen, for doing this for us. And I'll come back after Stephen. He's got about 20 minutes of really insightful, cool material about the temple. And then after that, I'll come back and wrap up talking about the dedication of the temple. So here's my friend Steven Lulich. Nope. Here's my friend.
Hi, everybody. Dan asked me to spend a few minutes talking about the temple, describing it and explaining some of the symbolism inherent in it. The temple does have a lot of symbolism that the Hebrew people at the time, the Israelites coming out of Egypt when they were instructed on how to build the tabernacle, the Israelite nation when Solomon built the temple. The Israelites coming out of Egypt were instructed to build the tabernacle. And then the Israelites, when Solomon built his temple, would have understood all of this imagery and symbolism that was built in to the temple, how it was built, what things were in it, how they were arranged. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. I'll talk about what those arrangements were and all that. But I also want to point out that the symbolism of the temple also carries through the rest of the Old Testament and the entire New Testament. Most notably, we have a lengthy vision of a future temple in the book of Ezekiel. And then we have a strongly parallel vision of the new temple recast as the New Jerusalem at the end of the book of Revelation. Okay, so the temple imagery, the temple symbolism carries through all the way from the beginning to the end. And it really does start at the beginning in the Garden of Eden. The temple and the tabernacle were in many ways representative of the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden was where God created this garden. He planted this garden. He planted the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He planted the tree of life. And he put the man and the woman whom he had created in this garden to tend it and to take care of it. And they could eat anything, any of the fruit of any of the trees, except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you know how that story unfolded. They were tempted. They disobeyed God. They sinned. They ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what did God do in response to that? He kicked them out. He said, lest they also reach out their hands to the fruit of the tree of life and eat it and live forever, they have to be kicked out. And so he kicked them out, and at the east entrance to the garden, he placed a cherubim with a flaming sword that stood guard over the garden and prevented them from getting into it. It guarded the way to the tree of life. But while they were in the Garden of Eden, before sin entered the world, they had in that place perfect communion and fellowship with God. God was with them. They were with God. After the sin, after the fall, they were kicked out. That communion, that fellowship with God was broken. This is symbolized in the way that the tabernacle was put together. The tabernacle has three basic parts. There's an outer court, which is really quite large. And any Israelite could come into the outer court to worship and to bring sacrifices to God. There was a bronze altar for where those sacrifices were made, and when people came to offer a sacrifice, particularly a sin offering, what they were doing was symbolically acknowledging that sin comes with a price, and the animal was metaphorically, symbolically taking their place on the altar. But somebody had to eat the meat of that sacrificed animal. One pastor that I had at a church before we came to Bloomington talked about it as, this is an animal that has had your sins placed on it, and it's been sacrificed, and the priests specifically had to eat it, the sin offering. And so all year they were eating this crap, this animal that represented sin, and that didn't get taken care of. They didn't get taken care of until the Day of Atonement. Okay, so you bring to the altar your sin offering. The priest has to eat it, and then the priest has to wash his hands. So there was a bronze basin. Okay, so coming in from the outer court, or coming into the outer court from the camp from outside, you would first come to the bronze altar for sacrificing. Next, from there, you would come to the bronze basin, which was where the priest would wash their hands. And then you would come to the tabernacle itself, the structure, the building, which had two parts. Remember, I said there were three parts total. The outer court is the first part, and then you had the holy place. The holy place had a screen. You had to get beyond that screen to get into the holy place. It had three pieces of furniture in it. It had a golden lampstand on the south side. You're entering from the east, and so to your left, on the south side, was the golden lampstand. To your right was, on the north side, the table of the showbread. And there were loaves of bread placed on that table, and they were replaced every now and then. Those there were 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, the lampstand represented the presence of God, the presence of God's Spirit, his watching over the people. The lampstand was set there opposite the table, and the priest was supposed to come in and tend the lights on the lampstand so that it would shine onto the bread and the table. And this has a parallel in the high priestly blessing. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord make his countenance to shine upon you, just like the lampstand shines upon the loaves of the showbread, which symbolize the people of God. So you have those two pieces of furniture here. You also have directly in front of you, coming further into the holy place, you also have the golden altar of incense. And the altar of incense during the day would have incense burned on it, creating a smoky cloud inside the holy place, and especially inside the next part, the Holy of Holies. Okay, during the day there was this cloud of incense, and at night the lampstand would be lit, and so you would have something like a pillar of fire at night and a pillar of smoke or cloud during the day in the in the tabernacle, and later in the temple. Okay, that makes you think of how God led the people of Israel out of Egypt, leading them as a pillar of cloud or a pillar of fire, depending on the time of day, and protecting them that way as well. He came behind them to separate them from the Egyptians when they were at the Red Sea, waiting for the Red Sea to be parted. So that's all symbolized in the construction of the tabernacle. The golden altar of incense is right in front of another curtain, and this is a heavy-duty curtain with pictures of cherubim embroidered in it. Okay, cherubim, like the angels with the flaming swords, guarding the way into the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve were kicked out. Okay, inside, beyond that curtain, was the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. That's where the Ark of the Covenant lived. Okay, the Holy of Holies was a cube. The dimensions are given in the book of Exodus. It's a cube. It's the same width, same length, same height, and the holy place just outside is twice as long as the Holy of Holies. In this way, the tabernacle actually resembles, and the Israelites at the time would have understood this to be a kind of a moving palace. The temple of God is the palace of God, because God is, after all, the king of creation. And the Egyptians had moving palaces like this as well. And in fact, there are inscriptions and drawings of the moving palace of Ramesses II, which looks a lot like the tabernacle and the temple in terms of its dimensions, and having a square or a cube as the inner sanctum. Now, in the inner sanctum of Ramesses' tent or tabernacle, there was a the word is escaping my mind at the moment, but there was a representation of Ramesses that lived there on top of a kind of a throne. Okay, it symbolically represented that Ramesses is the guy in charge here. This is his inner sanctum. Even if he's back in in the capital, in Ramesses, Ramesses, the capital city, even if he's back there and not with the tent carries his image. Okay, now the Israelite tabernacle also had a Holy of Holies, an inner sanctum. The Ark of the Covenant is where the image of God would have been on top of, if it were appropriate to represent God with images, golden images, silver images, whatever. And of course, God had told the Israelites, you do not make images of me. That is idolatry. And so there was no image of God on top of the Ark of the Covenant. But the Ark of the Covenant is the footstool of God. The idea is that God sits enthroned in heaven, and his feet come down and sort of touch down on earth at the location of the Ark of the Covenant. It is his footstool, and you've got on the mercy seat, you've got cherubim that are sort of hiding the presence of God right there where his feet would have come down and rested. Okay, in Isaiah, when Isaiah has this vision of God, the train of his robe came down and filled the temple, not the heavens, the temple. God is in the heavens, but God's feet and his robe are extending down to the temple, to the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy of Holies, and that's the vision that Isaiah sees. Now, there's more that we could talk about regarding the symbolism. That's all really, really cool stuff. I will just tell you really quickly 2 excellent books, aside from this one, which, well, that I guess it doesn't say it says Bible right there. Okay, doesn't have to be this particular Bible, but any Bible, of course, is the best thing to study to find out about the temple and tabernacle. In addition, I have found these 2 books to be very helpful. Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord? It's a biblical theology of the book of Leviticus. It sounds extremely dry. It's actually extremely interesting, but it is very dense. It's by Michael Morales. And The Temple and the Church's Mission by D.A. Carson. Also extremely dense. 2 really good books that really do a good job laying out a lot of this symbolism and what it all means. I want to highlight a couple final things. One, the lampstand. Back to the lampstand. The lampstand was shaped like a tree, and it was for burning oil, so there were flames on it. Okay, think of this: a tree that has fire associated with it. It's a lot like the burning bush. Okay, and it actually is also a lot like the tree of life, the tree that represents God's Spirit with us. That is just really cool, I think. I want to point out, I mentioned Ezekiel and Revelation. Ezekiel describes the new temple, and he describes it in very large terms. The future eschatological temple. It has dimensions that are cubic. And it describing the city of Jerusalem. For Ezekiel, the entire city of Jerusalem becomes the new Holy of Holies. It's a cube. It's where the presence of God lives. And that gets picked up in Revelation when John sees the vision of the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven and giving dimensions for it. It's a square or a cube. Both Ezekiel and Revelation, referring back or alluding back to the Garden of Eden, talk about the river of life coming out from the midst of this new city, this new Holy of Holies. The Garden of Eden had a river coming out of it, splitting into four and watering all the earth. The river of life comes out of Ezekiel's temple and out of the Revelation temple. And in both of those cases, in Ezekiel and in Revelation, associated very closely with the river of life, growing on its banks, is the tree of life. Okay? So we have this continuity of symbolism from the Garden of Eden to the Tabernacle and the temple, and Ezekiel's eschatological temple, which also happens to be the eschatological Jerusalem, and then John's New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. There's a continuity between them all. That's really cool, but think about this as well. During the Old Testament, after sin entered the world, Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden. There are cherubim with flaming swords blocking the way to the inner sanctum where we were otherwise supposed to be, with God, in the presence of God. So, the tabernacle and the temple is really, it's kind of like, it's God's way of symbolizing for us and telling us about how we are blocked from re-entering into that fellowship with Him that Adam and Eve enjoyed at the beginning, and which, I mean, the point for why God created us is to be in fellowship with Him, but that is blocked. And that fellowship is the blocking of that fellowship is symbolized in the workings and the structure of the tabernacle and the temple. You can't go in unless you're a priest. You can't go in unless you have first offered a sacrifice and washed your hands. You're supposed to eat the sacrifice too, and then you can go in and do your business. And but even there, you can't go beyond the curtain into the Holy of Holies unless you're one person, the high priest, and only on one day, the Day of Atonement. Okay? God is inside there, and if we try to get in, we will die. No one can see God and live. The two of the sons of Aaron tried to take their own sacrifices, their own whatever. The details are not really clear, but they went in doing things their own way, and God struck them dead. Okay, so there's a big problem here. How do we enter back into fellowship with God? In fact, when the tabernacle was first built, at the very end of Exodus, the presence of God comes down and takes up residence in the Holy of Holies, and even Aaron and even Moses could not enter the tent. And so that's where Exodus ends. God has shown up and we can't go near Him. That's where Leviticus then picks up. Here's what you do to make it so that you can actually get near to God. But it's all really temporary. It's all just an object lesson for us. As the author of Hebrews makes very clear, it is not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. The tabernacle and the workings of the tabernacle, the temple and the workings of the temple were not final. The things that they represent become finalized through Jesus. And again, the book of Hebrews talks a lot about this. Okay? Jesus offered Himself as the sacrifice for sin. Jesus took His own blood into the Holy of Holies, the real Holy of Holies, into the presence of God, and atoned for our sins there. Okay? And in so doing, he made a way for us to also follow him. In fact, when Jesus died, the Gospels tell us that the curtain separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies, that curtain was ripped in two, symbolizing access has now been granted. A way has been found, a way has been made, so that we can actually come into the presence of God. Again, Hebrews talks about that. Let us come into the presence of God, since we have such a great high priest, Jesus, who has gone before us with a perfect sacrifice as a perfect high priest. And think about this. The progression from the outer court into the most holy place, it's kind of like our experience as Christians following Jesus. We first come to the altar where Jesus was sacrificed, and the sacrament of communion is the eating of that sacrifice. Then we come to the bronze basin, where the washing happens. That's where our sacrament of baptism comes in. It's symbolizing the same thing. We must be cleansed before we can enter into the presence of God. We go into the presence of God, then into the holy place, where the showbread representing us, the showbread basks in the presence of the watchful eyes and the glory and the blessings of the Spirit of God, symbolized by the lampstand. And then we can go even further than that now, because the curtain has been torn, and we can actually we can offer our own sacrifice of praise on the golden altar of incense, prayers that go up and make a pleasing aroma to God, and we can actually enter into the throne room of God. All of this symbolically for now, but someday for real. And it is Jesus who made that way available to us, and who went before us, and who invites us to follow him. So that's a little bit about the temple. There's more. It's really cool stuff, and what it all means, and how it all points really ultimately ahead to Jesus and to the work that Jesus would do, the work that Jesus did do, and continues to do, and will eventually bring to its complete consummation. So, yeah, the temple. It's really cool.
So you can see why I had Steven do a little bit on the temple. Guy knows what he's talking about, and it's cool to hear him talk about that. So after the temple is constructed according to the pattern of the temple in Eden and the tabernacle, the cloud of the Lord's presence descends on the temple, and in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, we read the record of Solomon's prayer of dedication to the Lord at the temple opening. He begins by saying, "Lord, this is fulfillment of what you promised. You promised David that his son would build you a temple, and this is that. This is the fulfillment of that." And then he asks the Lord to keep the rest of his promises that he had made to David, that he would never fail to have a son on the throne if. And again, you see the conditional element of this covenant that God had struck with David. Solomon goes on in this prayer of dedication to acknowledge almost the absurdity of believing that God is housed in this temple. He says, the highest of heavens cannot contain you. So this temple, as glorious, magnificent as it is, doesn't contain you. But you've made your name, your presence in a special way, dwell here. So because of that, when your people turn their face to this temple and pray, hear them and forgive their sins. Throughout this prayer of dedication, the inevitability of sin is kind of sprinkled all throughout. Your people are going to sin, but have mercy on them, Lord. When they turn their face to this temple, have mercy, hear their pleas, and forgive their sin. Because of our sin, Solomon says, we'll be overcome by enemies. We'll experience drought and famine and plague, and when we do, we will repent. We will confess. Hear those confessions. Hear those pleas for forgiveness and answer. Then he turns his attention, and I love this, to the foreigner. He says, the foreigners are going to hear about your presence here in this temple. And they're going to come here, and they're going to pray at this temple. And Solomon says to the Lord, do whatever the foreigner asks of you, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your own people Israel, and may know that this house that I have built bears your name. All the way back to Abraham, God's mission for Israel was a global mission, right? That they would be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. And here at the dedication of this most central element of Israel's life, you see that global mission. When foreigners hear, Lord, answer their prayers, even the foreigners' prayers, so that they know you are God. Solomon's prayer of dedication kind of wraps up, and he says, if people sin, and everyone does, and are taken away to foreign lands, even in foreign lands, hear them. You're not contained by this temple, even if they're in Babylon or Assyria. Hear their prayers, Lord. In the same chapter, the Lord responds, and he says to Solomon, as for you, if you walk before me faithfully as David your father did, and do all that I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne, as I covenanted with David your father, when I said you shall never fail to have a successor to rule over Israel. But, he continues, if you turn away and forsake the decrees and commands I have given you, and go after and serve other gods, and worship them, then I will uproot Israel from my land, and I will give them, that I have given them, and will reject this temple that I have consecrated for my name. That's where we're going to end today. That's an ominous note to end on, but it does set the trajectory for the next week or two. We are going to pick up pace. We won't spend another 11 weeks getting through the rest of the Old Testament, I guarantee it. Maybe 2, maybe 3 at the most. But this is setting the trajectory. If God's people and God's kings obey, they'll be established and be blessed. But if they forsake the covenant and go after foreign gods, they'll be uprooted, and the temple itself, the symbol of God's presence, will be destroyed. All that's foreshadowing a future king who will perfectly uphold God's laws, a future temple that, though destroyed, will be rebuilt. It points us ahead to Christ. With those words, I leave you this afternoon. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to diving in a little bit more next week. Take care. Have a great day.